I'm going to talk about confinement in Levinas's work. The term confinement, confinement, first appeared in Between Us, Thinking of the Other, a collection of articles in 1991. In Entre nous, confinement is mentioned explicitly in the foreword of the book, and then a dialogue made in 1987. There is also in confinement the very matter of things, the materiality of matter, and hence, as he put it, the analogue of the pure being before or without ethics. If the appearance of the term confinement is very late, in Levinas' last writings, the ideas that it covers emerged at the very beginning of his philosophical itinerary, at the time when he wore, as he will proudly recall 50 years later, an abundance of very black hair. The idea of confinement emerged as soon as 1935 in On Escape, de l'évasion, where Levinas first exposed his personal philosophy, a philosophy where there is no question of ethics and otherness, but of the solitary self who is struggling with being and longing for evasion. I would like to show how the 1935 essay outlines what Levinas will refer to more than half a century later as confinement. Following the evolution of Levinasian thought after the war and the emergence of the other, as well as the radical turn his thought took in Otherwise Than Being, I will try to show how closing in on oneself, confinement, characterizes the very fact of being and how it can be deconfined. And since it is always good to keep surprises for the end, first of all, you'll see that there was the first surprise was for me because I'm going to talk for the first time, and I think for the last time, about physics. And the other surprise is for you. At the end of my talk, we'll see together a very short excerpt of an interview with Emmanuel Levinas. So it's customary to present On Escape as a response to Heidegger, as if it were self-evident. In fact, On Escape opens with a critique that is not directed to ontology or ontologism, but to idealism, in which Levinas sees not only a philosophic trend or doctrine, but the very spirit of Western civilization and its ideal of freedom. The freedom that idealism defends is an ideal of autarky, of self-sufficiency. It is a conviction that the self can enjoy absolute independence from being, that it has the power to withdraw from its heaviness and brutality by turning in on itself. In this movement of reflection on oneself, which defines since Descartes thought or consciousness, this power of reflection which manifests the sovereignty of the subject. For Levinas, this self-sufficiency is an illusion. Paradoxically, it is in this belief in perfect autarky that ontologism infiltrates idealism. The self-sufficiency that idealism claims is in fact a category of being. This is what Levinas clearly means, I quote, "This category of sufficiency is conceived in the image of being such as things offer to us. The things are," stress on are. The brutality of its assertion, that of the fact of being, is absolutely sufficient and refers to nothing else. Being is. Lettre A. It is thus in On Escape that we find, for the first time, the question of this closure of the self, which characterizes the very structure of matter. It is what is uncovered when one distinguishes between being and beings, or in Levinas' own terms, between existence and existence. Usually, we are not dealing with being itself, the very fact of being, but with its qualities or attributes, with ways of existing. Levinas embraces being and lays it bare. He drops the mask under which it usually hides. He brings to light a heaviness and brutality that are not only attributes of being, but its very structure, its materiality. As he states, things are the primary model of being. The fact that things are is the fact that they exist without reference to anything other than themselves. It's a closure upon themselves. As Levinas will say right after the war, in Existence and Existence, and contrary to Heidegger, things are not ready to hand. They are not intended for use. The material object is not already caught in a system of references which ensures its intelligibility. It's not coated with a form that conceals its nakedness. So the fact of being is not, as Heidegger claimed, intelligibility, source of light and meaning. It is heavy and thus resists understanding. Moreover, the brutality of its assertion is absolutely sufficient and refers to nothing else. In Existence and Existence, Levinas states that matter is a very fact of the there is, Lilia. This is what emerges in the chapter of Existence and Existence, entitled Exoticism. For Levinas, it is in art that one makes the experience of the there is. Hence the idea he develops a year later in 1948 in Reality and its Shadow. Art is a regression towards the order of the elementary of matter or matter caught in its brutality. As he says, materiality is thickness, coarseness, massivity, wretchedness. It is what is a brute but impassive presence. This way of conceiving matter sheds light on another meaning than the one usually given to the word brutality. To say it in French, this is the difference between brutal, violent, cruel, and brute, rough. The there is not only the brutal being, but the rough being. As when we speak of raw material, the diamond before it is cut, or following the example given by Levinas, the undifferentiated blocks which prolong the statues of Rodin. And between us, I'm longing very much for Musée Rodin in Paris. The brutality of matter, that matter in its raw state, is for Levinas the very fact of the there is. It is under the name of hypostasis that Levinas describes the event by which existence tears itself away from anonymous existence and frees itself from it by asserting herself as a subject. But freedom very quickly turns into responsibility, not yet a responsibility for the other, but a responsibility for myself, the obligation to bear the burden of one's own existence. In Time and the Other, one discovers another dimension of materiality. Almost 30 years before the publication of Otherwise Than Being, where it will play a central role, the Spinozist theme of conatus, or perseverance in being, of which Heideggerian notion of care, Sorge, is derived, appears in Time and the Other. It is the way of taking care of oneself, or the concern that the being takes of its duration and its conservation. In Existence and Existence, and in Time and the Other, ethics is only at its beginning. Even though the other is already grasped in her absolute otherness, We are still far from the idea that I am responsible for her. On the contrary, it is the other who saves me from my confinement within myself. As Roger Burgrave said so well, hypostasis, position, and self-assertion must become ecstasis, a position outside of oneself. Ecstasis, to be outside of oneself, is the position of the self in totality and infinity, where I'm no more closed in on myself, mired in my materiality, but in relation to exteriority, in relationship with the other, who is both outside of me and higher than me. Having said, insofar as the other faces her, the self still retains its integrity. She is not altered by her relationship with others. This is no longer the case in Otherwise Than Being and Beyond, in Levinas's late writings. The other is no longer in front of me, but in me. And this is where the term confinement comes into play, this time explicitly in Entre nous. Even if this term does not appear in the English translation, and it's too bad, it is indeed the one that Levinas uses in the French original text. In the foreword to Entre nous, Levinas evokes, I quote, the matter of things, hard matter, solidity, the closed in upon self, all the way down to the level of the subatomic particles of which physicists speak. In the original French, le fermer sur soi, jusque dans les confinements intra-atomiques dont parlent les physiciens. In Dialogue on Thinking to the Other, it describes, I quote, the materiality of matter in its ultimate reaches, underlying the solidity of the atom of which physicists speak, la matérialité de la matière dans ses ultimes confinements. What then is confinement in physics? As a distinguished physicist explained to me, neutrons and protons, that is to say, the particles that make up the nucleus of atoms, are themselves made up of subatomic particles called quarks. The quarks interact very strongly. This is called strong interactions. The particularity of this force is that the more we try to separate two quarks, the more difficult it becomes to separate them. It's like a rubber band from which you pull both ends. The more you stretch, the harder it is to stretch. The rubber band stretches but doesn't break. This phenomenon that makes it very difficult to separate the quarks is called confinement. Matter is, so to speak, folded back on itself, ultimately closed in on itself. In physics, the term confinement has a positive meaning. The force that prevents quarks from separating ensures the stability of the components of the atomic nucleus. For Levinas, it is exactly the opposite. The stability of the atomic nucleus that is provided by confinement is a structure of matter with its hardness, strength, and closure. It is I quote, the nucleation, le noyautage, and atomic confinement of matter. In the text that I have quoted, Levinas sees in the materiality of matter, in its confinement, the analog or the metaphor of pure being. And that's what he said to Bernard-Henri Lévy in an interview probably made in 1991, the year Entre nous was published. There he spoke about Vassili Grossman's Life and Destiny and Little Goodness, La Petite Bonté, not institutionalized, goodness, but goodness in relationship between a person and another person. So I'm just reading Levinas's words in the interview, his response to Bernard-Henri Lévy. Little goodness is the rupture of being. Being has only one concern, it is to be. It's already in the realm of physics. Even when you break the atom, there is what remains closed. It's the plant that wants to plant itself and dries out the other plants. Then, in the animal order, it's the struggle for life. And then there is the human where there are wars. And it is in the human that this extraordinary thing is born, goodness. In goodness, there is the willingness to die for the other. So what Levinas says about the confinement of matter suggests that physics is entirely ontological. Nevertheless, one should be wary of jumping to conclusions. As a physicist I consulted on this subject told me, you can still deconfine matter. At very high energies, you can break the nucleus into its components. Thus, I dare to add something to what Levinas said. Besides confinement, Levinas borrowed from physics the word fission, and even nuclear fission, in order to describe what he calls denucleation, meaning the event in which the nucleus of the ego is cored out. Therefore, if confinement is the analog of pure being before or without ethics, aren't there other physical phenomena the analog of ethics, or otherwise than being? Ultimately, physics, as well as science as a whole, has to do with ethics. And that's exactly what Levinas said in an interview entitled Morality in the Laboratory that appeared in Levinas Studies in 2011. And I'm especially happy to mention it since I worked on this text together with my friend Peter Atherton, who made a beautiful translation of it. This interview was broadcast on French television on March 26, 1978. It marks the occasion of the publication of the second edition of Difficult Freedom.
Je me retourne tout de suite vers ceux qui, même vers l'exercice rigoureux de la science, vers cette intimité spéciale qui existe chez le savant entre lui et la matière. Cette intériorité spéciale qu'est l'intériorité du mathématicien. Malgré tout ce qu'on dit de notre temps, contre la science, contre ses incertitudes, contre la technique qu'elle a engendrée, on ne peut pas oublier que la dégradation de l'humain à laquelle nous assistons, le seul domaine où l'homme se contrôle, où il est non bavard, où il est non violent, où il est pur, c'est quand il est au laboratoire. Ces instances de laboratoire se recoupent après, se renouent après. Ça. Il y a toute une durée de la recherche scientifique. Mais c'est là que actuellement, le lieu de la morale et même de la sainteté.
Quand le juif étudie le Talmud, est-ce qu'il est dans un laboratoire?
Certainement aussi.
Il est dans un laboratoire?
C'est quelque chose de semblable en effet. Je trouve toujours une espèce d'épuration, n'est-ce pas, intérieure devant le travail du savant. N'est-ce pas?
Now I'm going to read the English translation. My immediate response is to turn to the rigorous exercise of science, to this special intimacy that exists between the scientist and matter, this special interiority that is the interiority of the mathematician. There is a lot one can say in our time against science, against its uncertainties, against the technology that has engendered it. One cannot forget that amid the degradation of the human to which we are witness today, the sole domain where man controls himself, where he is not worthy, where he is not violent, where he is pure, is when he is in the laboratory. These isolated moments in the laboratory eventually fall into place, relate to each other afterwards. Henceforth, there is the whole duration of scientific research. But the laboratory is at the present time the place of morality and even of holiness. And then the interviewer asked Levinas, is a Jew in a laboratory when he studies the Talmud? And Levinas answered, ah, certainly. Thank you very much.